I'm going to start off by introducing industrial design at Lawrence Tech. So in the Bachelor's of Science in Industrial Design program at LTU, which is a NASAD accredited professional's bachelor's degree. It's a project-centered curriculum. At its core focuses on sustainability, ergonomics, user experience, product psychology, human-centered design, entrepreneurship, and leadership. Today, we are hosting our first LTU IDSA student chapter event for Industrial Design Day. Our student chapter mission is to create an environment at LTU that enriches the personal and professional lives of our student members in promoting excellence in education, collaboration, and skill building relating to industrial design. We come together to build a better foundation for our future, considering ourselves as family, with the older members guiding the underclassmen and knowledge being shared freely. Today, our guest speaker is Karen Lee. Karen Lee is a designer based in Detroit, Michigan, who focuses on materials and objects. Her current body of work engages in objects that redefine their own roles in the relationship to the domestic landscape. Alongside her design studio, she also works as part of Nike's design team, and she will be sharing her process and experience with us today.
Great.
So yeah, nice to meet you, Karen.
Nice to meet you guys. Great. Okay, so yeah, just a bit about me and my background. So I'm originally from Los Angeles, where I kind of grew up, and then I, for my undergrad, ended up going to the Rhode Island School of Design. I studied textiles design, and I've had such an interesting trajectory because when I studied textiles design for my undergrad, I thought I was going to go into fashion. Like I was I was like really on that sort of trajectory and wanting to work in the fashion industry in New York in particular. So while during my studies at RISD, I had interned at a couple New York fashion companies and realized how awful the environment was at the time. I'm sure it's maybe better, but just having some insight into that industry, especially from an intern perspective, was really just really eye-opening for me. And so when I had graduated in 2013, I had no idea what I was going to do. And so I ended up actually that summer interning at this company, which you guys might have heard of, called PacSun. They're like more of a mall-based brand. I was doing print and pattern work. And I was really interested, especially from my textile studies, like tactility and working within the structure of materials and textiles. And I think little did I know at the time that kind of could be the next step for me, which it actually ended up being so. So while at PacSun interning that summer, I actually just got a cold call from Nike. They had seen my work on like online. I had a website, a LinkedIn, and they reached out and they're like, hey, your work looks really interesting. We're just starting to build this materials design group at our company. Like, we'd love to learn more about you and stuff. And so ended up at Nike. So I moved up to Portland. I was there for 5 years, worked in mainly in their footwear product creation group. So basically designing, concepting materials for a whole range of different kinds of sneakers. I started in sportswear, which you'll see later in this portfolio, like the breadth of the different kinds of shoes I worked on, but then kind of moved into performance basketball, which was really interesting. Got to work on, some like Kobe's and Kyrie's and LeBron's, if you guys know those names. And then transitioned into cleated, which is like football and baseball, did a little bit of golf and tennis. So I've had such a huge breadth of experience within Nike and the footwear industry. And then after 5 years of doing that, I was starting to feel like I wanted to return to school and really focus on my own voice as a designer. And, I was feeling a little bit lost in terms of my own authorship and what I knew how to do the job. I knew what I was like capable of doing within the context of corporate design. But for me personally, I was struggling with just finding who I was as a designer and I wanted to explore what I was capable of. So I ended up leaving Nike and actually moving out here where I studied at Cranbrook Academy of Art in the 3D design program, which is more of this hybrid kind of open studio. You know, it's like a little bit of ID, but a little bit of furniture, a little bit of conceptual art, all kind of mixed into one. And so from that program, learned a lot with building and getting more into the space of designing and building, but also still being influenced by tactility, you know, materiality, bringing that along as I'm building my own narrative. And then I graduated in March, and then actually ended up landing a teaching gig at CCS. So now I'm at CCS teaching in their color materials graduate design studies group, and also teaching in the undergrad craft and materials design groups, or craft and materials studies, which is all the different craft studies. Anyway, so that's my long-winded intro. I'll just jump into my work. So the way I've divided it up is the first part of it is Cranbrook, and then the next part of it is all Nike. So feel free, if you have any questions, just shout. I'm more than happy to answer. So yeah, I consider myself a materials and an object designer. I feel like I take on more of this hybrid design role now, and I think a lot of designers are feeling that way, that sort of interdisciplinary way of working and thinking, and taking from one sort of like, I don't know, one discipline, say textiles, and then meshing into like furniture or meshing into ceramics. You know, like people are, I think, really honing in on like this sort of hybridity, which has been really interesting. And I definitely consider that for myself as a designer. So just a couple of things I worked on at the beginning of Cranbrook. I was doing a lot of work designing glass objects, and I wanted to just sort of start by like just kind of talking to like semantics and like the language of water and water vessels. I was kind of on this weird filtration kick, and so I developed like a series or collection of vessels that talk to like, yeah, the language of filtration and sort of that transparency and being able to see a process happening. And so this was more of like a discursive sort of project about water filtration and what that means for society. And then from there, that was like a big body of work I did. And then I moved into this other new body of work where I was interested in like really understanding how to use the lathe and getting in the wood shop. So I was just exploring radial forms and kind of stacking, or the language of stacking with different kinds of craft materiality, so ceramics, glass, and wood. And just starting to find some interesting lines and profiles that would occur just by, you know, combining these different things, and what does the materiality start to like say about these objects, and kind of playing, you know, getting into the conversation of form and material and how they're starting to work with each other or not. And so this is sort of a manifestation of that. And I was also really interested in baking sourdough at the time. So I wanted to create glazes that had kind of had that effect of these sorts of like creatures that exist within these vessels, and how do the vessels also speak to like these like entities. So definitely more of like a poetic approach to designing. From that project, it evolved into this, which Culture Club, again, interested in sourdough fermentation and vessels that kind of do that, and how do you like express the language of like something fermenting but on the exterior, and also speaking to like a system of objects and kind of that like ecosystem of things that happen and occur, you know, within fermentation or sourdough, but how do you blow that out into your objects? And so this was a really fun project where I got to not only I turned all the legs and that kind of crazy form, but I also was working with CNCing for the first time with wood, and then worked with or collaborated with a ceramicist and a glassblower to help get some of these forms made. And then from there, I got into this interesting space where I wanted to talk more about objects and systems and how they sort of start to relate to each other. And I was doing that by thinking about these glass forms as, again, like entities, and what is that interaction they have with like a built almost like a little built environment, but how is that like, you know, this table setting or what does a like ambiguous table setting look like with these like entities that like kind of interact with it, not just like the humans who are interacting with the glass, but how is the glass interacting with, you know, something else. So I thought that was a fun thing to explore, which this as like a smaller scale project eventually led me to what ultimately was my big thesis for Cranbrook, which um, ended up being this piece, which I was really excited about because I was thinking a lot about um, just how do we engage in such a way with our objects, and but also how do the objects also engage with us. So there is this interesting thing that started happening as I, you know, was working with Brett, who's one of my good collaborators, with this building, like creating these ceramic forms, like life size, and then what is their relationship to, you know, this like wiggly table that has these crazy CNC'd wooden forms. Definitely very playful, but also speaking to a bit of like ambiguity and thinking about objects that have this kind of like in-betweenness. You know, it's like this table, it's a table, but it's also not really a table. I talk a lot about objects in my own work. I talk a lot about objects having their own agency. So it's like you look at this piece and you're thinking like these little elements, these little vessels start to become their own entities, and what does that say about that relationship to me? And so really questioning, thinking about your relationship to this greater domestic piece in a way where it's like you're not the main person of this whole narrative. You know, it's like there are other like beings that like you live with, you know, and how does that start to change the way you think about the objects you have in your life, in considering like longevity of objects, and that, you know, tying to further down the road, maybe conversations around sustainability, but I wouldn't go all the way down there. I would just say like, how do you sort of reframe how someone looks at their own object that, you know, is less about a dominating effect where it's like we own the object, but no, the objects also coexist with us and in our world. So kind of thinking more about you know, more about how all of our domestic goods kind of do that with us. So we live in this like ecosystem with everything. So that's like the big thesis work that I had from Cranbrook, which was exciting. And then here's some close-up images of those CNC'd legs, which was really fun and a huge learning experience for me. I had to learn how to program CNC files, and that was completely new to me, and how to sand and like set it all up. So for someone who has like a textile background, jumping into like woodworking was definitely very interesting and a lot of learnings, but I had a lot of fun doing that. And then from that piece, this is the most recent piece I've made, and you guys might have seen this in the Never Normal show. So this again was a collaboration that I did with Brett, my ceramics collaborator, and you know, in a similar language from that last piece with the table, thinking about, you know, objects and ambiguity and sort of the in-betweenness of objects. So we wanted to explore a bookshelf, but we wanted to do it in such a freaky way. And we've been like looking at a lot of like weird like slugs and snails and worms and just these like creatures that are like a part of us and a part of the everyday that we don't normally interact with, but they're there and they're part of this ecosystem. And how does that then, you know, that really inspired the form and the sort of what I like to say primordial language. So this is a bookshelf, right? And but it's such a strange like frame form, and then the like slats that are placed on it are, you know, completely ceramic with like a crazy resin finish. But really talking to more of like an earthen form and more of like a direct link to the earth, or kind of having that sort of vibe. But we called this project Snail Home, which is kind of fun. So that was the last piece that I did, which was really exciting and fun. And for the frame, like I didn't make the frame. I worked with a collaborator or fabricator here in Detroit. It's really great that I've worked with a lot in some of my previous projects. So yeah, any questions so far before I transition into Nike work?
I do have a question. Oh, go ahead, Jane.
Yeah, I wanted. Hi, Karen. This is Adrian.
Hi.
I'm very interested in that woodworking project, and I'm interested in the way you CNC the big pieces that form a U. So
Mm-hmm.
was that like a big tree trunk that you had to put into, or were they slabs that you glued together and then formed that shape?
Yeah, good question. They're huge slabs that I milled and glued up. So they're just massive glue ups that were, just
Gotcha.
rectilinear form that I then CNC'd.
Okay, great. Awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
My question was about the glaze that was in your distillery project, and also your the stacking wood and ceramic and glass pieces. So was it a long experimenting period to get to that almost bubbly looking glaze? Because glaze tend to, the glass melts and it's tend to move towards where the gravity is. So I was wondering how did you actually come up with that?
Yeah, well, so that glaze, there is a known glaze called crater glaze that has that kind of texture or that kind of materiality. And so I knew about that just from like previous ceramics courses I've taken. And I just like looked up like crater, like I guess there's like this ongoing database you can like access where like will tell you, people will upload recipes for glazes that they've made before, and sometimes you'll follow it and it doesn't turn out the way you do. So like we actually had to like try it 2 or 3 times. Like we found an existing crater glaze formula, but then we had to kind of like tune it, and I worked with someone who was really good with different glaze properties to get to that point where it felt like real close to what I was trying to achieve. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, I had a question.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Paul, by the way. My question was if a student wanted to take on prototyping, and let's just say they wanted to get into glass making or the ceramics, how would a student go about like finding people or finding experts in that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. It's funny because like, I'm not a glass blower. I've maybe taken a couple of ceramics classes, but I'm a no ceramics expert by any means. And I think at Cranbrook was, for me, it was easier because all of those disciplines were kind of there on campus and I can like leverage that. But in terms of glass, there's no glass blowing at Cranbrook. So I actually had reached out to some people that I knew and like from CCS or part of that community because I knew they had a really good glass blowing hot shop. And so I ended up getting connected with this guy, Matt, who I think is an adjunct there. And so we started a conversation and now we're like best friends. But I've worked with him a lot on a lot of different projects. But I think like to go back to your question, it's about just finding the right people, like just even like cold emailing, if you're interested in that. It depends on what, like if you want just a fabricator, because there are a lot of services out there in greater Metro Detroit where, you pay a fee or, pay a fee to get things produced by fabricators. But it ultimately, I think, is about your networks and just reaching out if you want to kind of get connected in that way. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's also just, I feel like it's a matter of like getting for the student or just the individual to get comfortable with like reaching out to people. But yeah, that does answer it. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm like, yeah, I'm definitely the kind of person that always loves reaching out to new people. Like I'm always like, what are you into? Like, tell me more about your things. Could we work together? Like I just am naturally like that. But I feel like if you set out with like good intentions and have a really compelling thing that you want to work on with someone, like I think people are totally down.
I have another question going with Paul's question. I was wondering how, actually tell us the process a little bit of how you were able to showcase your ideas via sketches, renders to these experts to really get your ideas really into reality. I'd like to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, like how to work with the fabricator.
Yep.
Uh-huh. I mean, you know, I've done it many ways. Like I've done it through just sketching on a napkin. I've done it, you know, and like putting measurements on there. I mean, that's not the best. That's like if you're in a pinch. But honestly, I think the best way is normally like if you know Rhino or any kind of like 3D rendering software, especially if you're getting into the space of actually getting the right proportion and getting like, you know, to spec what you want. Like I honestly feel like 3D rendering is usually the best way to get there, but also like hands-on prototyping too. And I know that's something that, you know, in the industrial design side of things, it's like pretty like, you know, you'll really understand scale so much better. I think that's one area that I personally am not very good with is prototyping, because I just always want to jump straight into the final material, which is not the smartest way to go about it. But it really depends. I think it depends on how you work as a designer. But I think oftentimes it's through rendering. Also in terms of like picking out finishes, you know, materials and stuff like that, like I tend to have a rendering and then I'll work closely with the fabricator to like source the right kind of glass rods or, you know, work with the ceramicist to get the right kind of glaze. But then I'll like, you know, also with the form, I usually like once I've gotten a good relationship with someone, I trust them and how they like start to execute the form. But normally like even just like a little like cobbled together form where you're like, okay, these are the kinds of proportions, whether it's out of styrofoam or I don't know, glue, paper, whatever, like to get the idea across to a fabricator, like I feel like that's usually the best method. That and a 3D rendering software.
Was there any errors that went along that process and that you had to kind of like help out the maker?
Yeah, all the time.
Okay.
I mean, there's so many times where I'm like, okay, I want it like this. And you give them the like, you know, you give them the renderings, you give them the dimensions, and then they, you know, especially with maybe smaller things that come back and I'm like, that's not what I was hoping for. And maybe like they'll go and do another iteration, hopefully. You know, but sometimes with like bigger stuff like this kind of shelf, like you really have to be more lock in step with them to make sure that, you know, that it, I feel like throughout the process of them making, like you being closer and kind of working with them to help get to the right proportion and shape and all that is really important.
I'm assuming that communication was probably a big factor in these projects, you know?
Absolutely.
That's what, of course. Well, thank you. Thank you, Karen.
Yeah, totally. Cool. Well, I'll move on to the next part. Okay, so my Nike work, and this also is more sequential. So this is the beginning couple of things are like what I was starting with, and then towards the end is like what I last was doing at Nike. So materials design at Nike. So that was really interesting. It's just going backwards now, but entering the world of Nike was really interesting because for me, I like thought, you know, I was like coming out of textile design, which I think has there's a certain kind of craft vibe that goes along with textiles that I think has changed a lot like over the years. But going from this kind of textiles world of RISD and into Nike, where it was like, you know, sleek, fast design, it was about like attitude and a different kind of language. Like it really was a huge learning experience for me and in understanding how to know a brand and understand what they're trying to do or what their whole value system is about, and then how do you go about then designing for that. You know, it's like you're not, again, this is so different from what I was doing in the previous works that I showed you guys, where it was like, for me, that was about me just exploring my voice and my interests. But now it's like you're actually at a company and it's important that, you know, you might have certain aesthetics or a certain eye, but you're still doing it through that brand perspective. So a lot of learnings from that. But this is this slide, there's a couple of these kinds of slides where it gives you an idea of setting a direction, a design direction. So in materials design, we oftentimes every season had to do that, like kind of express the kinds of materials that we wanted to put through like a seasonal lens. Every season we might have like the same kinds of shoes, if but then there'd be different kinds of material applications put on them based on like the stories or the seasonality. Like, you know, a holiday shoe is much different in like a build than like a summer shoe, you know, like winter elements versus summer, very different. So those are all the things that I had to kind of consider while designing materials for Nike. So sorry, just to go back. So like for example, this was like a direction for spring 17 that was about metallics, structure. It was very like about shifting, a shifting kind of vibe and revealing through the materials. And so knowing that, the next slide kind of gives you that how some of those design attributes are then kind of filtered into the product. So I would say maybe the shoes on the right really speak to that kind of concept that was proposed about shifting. So I designed with a bunch of different kinds of materials while I was at Nike. I wasn't just designing textiles like knits and wovens. I was also working with synthetic materials, different leathers, hardwares, trims, anything you can think of that goes on a shoe, any like polyurethane / TPU products. So this one on the right is a circular knit jacquard, and it had these like really cool stripes. But the thing about the stripes is that it created this like shifting pattern based on the colors and the tones and the way that the structure was placed. And it had this really cool like vibrating shift effect that really spoke to some of those earlier attributes I just shared. This is another direction example, this time for spring 17, which we're exploring this idea of lightweight protection and how does that come out within our materials. So that was done, that kind of filtered into this, which I was briefed on like a shoe, like how do you redesign or design materials for a bunch of these different kinds of Air Maxes. It's just like a heritage line of Nike. These models like came out like a long time ago, but they tend to bring them back and like refresh them in new ways with different materials and colors to like, you know, still nod to the heritage and the DNA of Nike, but then also bring, like we talk a lot about like bringing the consumer like to a new journey. So this was a summer 16 kind of execution where it was this like coated sandwich mesh. It had these big open holes for breathability, but it was also durable. And it had a really nice soft lining interior that was also breathable. So that was that. And then to go from that shift from summer to holiday, like this is a good example of how seasonality affects material design. So, you know, when you get into like these kinds of sportswear, fashion inspired sneakers, you have to also consider the consumer, which we talk a lot about, more like urban based and kind of, you know, walking like all the time, like through all the elements, like snow, like whatever. And so how do you design materials that kind of offer that kind of protection? And so a lot of these sorts of textures and materials and finishes kind of nod to that sort of protective, but also like durable quality. I worked with like, I think designing this like kind of leather and doing this almost like sandblasted texture that had this sort of, you know, rubberized feel and tactility. So it's kind of interesting to see how like, again, a seasonal approach to materials really affects the product. This is another version of that where it's like speaking to like waterproof textiles. So even though this is sort of like almost like a ripstop, it's like a woven material, there is like a DWR coating, which just means like a water repellent coating that helps repel water. And so thinking about that story of protection from the elements and how that, you know, plays out within some of the material properties. Oops. I also got to work on some really fun projects, like this shoe on the left is an indigo dyed fabric that we worked with this vendor called Loop Wheeler in Japan. They're based in Tokyo, and they are known for this kind of like soft, I think it's like a circular knit. And so we want to do a really cool collaboration with them. And at that time, we were also starting to get into like an indigo story, because speaking to like crafted details. And so that was, this shoe on the left is sort of a manifestation of that. And then on the right, this is every year there's this project called the Dornbecker Project, where a select group of designers get to be partnered up with a kid from the children's hospital. Oftentimes, like I think they have a terminal illness, but then we let the kids design their own shoes, like however way they want and whatever colors and materials they want to use. And then we just bring their ideas to life. So this was a kid who wanted, his name is Brody. He really wanted his shoe to look like a brain, because he was I think his illness was something with like having to do with his brain. But it ended up being a really fun project, and definitely really crazy, some crazy sneakers that came to life. I haven't spoken or I haven't touched much on the process in which a material designer works. So of course you have things where you're looking through catalogs and speccing materials or redeveloping a new material from vendors. But this project was really fun in that this was for a Kobe shoe, where I was playing with this idea of this sort of embroidered cording inlay that you can do on an embroidery machine, and just basically working closely with the factories, getting different kinds of executions of how that embroidery stitch can go over a cord, but then also working with an outsider vendor. There's this really cool group called the London Embroidery Studio. And so I was coming up with concepts with them and just kind of playing into, for Kobe, like his style of play, like he used to be very like, also kind of in the similar to Kyrie, where it's like very fast, you know, cuts on the court. And so how does that kind of style of play affect the aesthetic of the materials? And in that, I was thinking about things that allow for a certain kind of lockdown, which is what certain players like that need when they go to cut on the court. And so I was thinking about how ways this kind of cording can provide that kind of lockdown support where it's needed, and how maybe some of also that embroidery, that kind of zigzagging, very linear form or design language can speak to like fast, quick moves, which is the way that these kinds of players go about performing on the court. And so did a bunch of different iterations. Also, you know, tried different kinds of techniques of overlaying the chords in such a way on what's called a shell pattern, is when, you know, the shoe is kind of laid flat. This bottom right shoe was really cool in that it was sort of the very first iteration or first early prototypes of that cording technique and how to overlay it. But that looked too close to an Audi shoe, so we pivoted. And it actually ended up being here, which then everything was actually covered up, which was fine because we talk also a lot about getting athlete insights into how we think about our shoes. So not only the like, you know, the performance attributes and stylistic considerations and all that, but also like, what does this athlete want? And so the footwear designer who I work really closely with actually like talked to Kobe at this time, and Kobe was really interested in like the veins in a horse and that kind of conveying a sense of strength. And so we ended up actually covering up the cording, but still having that like X-ray effect to kind of speak to that, which is cool. But we also like kept some of that language of the zigzag embroidery on the swoosh. So on the left side is like the main shoe, and we had different colorways, and then sometimes we'll do special material ways. So like this on the right was sort of like an embossed snakeskin patterning that was to like nod to this idea of Kobe being like the Black Mamba. So this is like a special March Madness shoe that came out that still used similar materials to the base material, the base version, but got, you know, some special updates based on some cool narrative. Just some other kind of explorations into materials. I did a lot of stuff too with like the Kyrie Irving shoe. I worked on the 3, the 4, and also a little bit of the 5. So we were doing a lot of, again, like open meshes and kind of creating an engineered effect where you get like zonal holes in certain areas to allow for breathability and like quickness and less weight, and working with that kind of shifting pattern. So you can see on the top right, you know, there's that kind of shift, like you kind of get that read. And then the bottom shoe is kind of another iteration of that. Like these two shoes actually didn't get released, but that you could see how they eventually got to the final version of the 4, which actually ended up being this. So you still get the holes on the like what's called the vamp or the forefoot of the shoe, but then we actually ended up putting like leather or nice suede with an embroidered swoosh on the quarters, because there's this whole deal of wanting to connect the shoe back to like more of like a street style, and so having leather as a material kind of signifies or signals that. It was also really cool because we got to do a lot of different versions of different kinds of leather on that kind of paneling to nod to different kinds of stories we wanted to tell around Kyrie and the greater game of basketball. It's going back. This is the Kyrie 3. This was really fun too, was working with casting PU pieces on a mesh. And so this graphic actually was generated by the footwear designer that I worked with, but we got to do some really interesting effects and finishes on this cast PU portion. And then this is another way to show how materialities kind of change based on the kinds of narratives. So this is another March Madness pack. The concept was Mamba mentality, so nodding again to like the legacy of Kobe. And this was fun, and I'm showing you guys this because I worked closely with a color designer to kind of get these little like chiclety type colors where we were at the factory like throwing little pieces of rubber like into the molds and just seeing how that kind of plays out, which ended up being a really cool effect. And then also had this cool like snakeskin story of the leather on like the Kyrie, and doing these like cool little hologram hits, or these like little iridescent swooshes. This was another shoe I worked on. This was the Soldier, which was LeBron's shoe. This was really cool, like working on these sorts of like dimensional, almost scale. It was like a circular knit jacquard that had these like really interesting dimensional scales. And so I wanted to play that up because it also married into LeBron's main shoe, which was the LeBron 15 at the time. And you can see on the left, like all the different kinds of pattern iterations that I went through to eventually get to this one, which I felt like was the most dimensional and compelling and had, you know, really nice soft hand to it as well. But yeah, his shoes are all about lockdown and kind of like strong attributes. And so how do you create this feeling of armor, and like visually, how do you design that look of armor? And so I thought this sort of scaling pattern really spoke to that. And then some other colorways of what that would look like and how it plays out. What's cool about the straps is I got to work with like playing up different kinds of heathering effects by just kind of switching out yarns or playing with twisted yarns. And then this is moving backwards. This is the Soldier 11, which is before the Soldier 12, but this was really cool. I got to like develop, I mean, all these different pieces on top, not the bottom unit, but all of this stuff is like basically what I would design and work closely with the footwear designer to really make sure it's the right, it has the right kind of look, but also the right kind of functionality for the athlete or for the kinds of players who would be wearing this kind of shoe. And then moving into my last couple of projects before I left Nike full-time was I worked on some cool football cleats. This was called the Force Savage, which also had these like little cast PU components. And what was really fun was playing up the finishes. And so I got to work with the vendors to kind of play around with different kinds. So this was like a gloss black finish. I also done some cool marbling ones and iridescent effects, and all of those things honestly were so fun to explore. And it was cool because you can match up some of these designed materials and finishes to the actual like narrative that they're trying to tell in the shoes. Like I think this particular colorway was about like some kind of special launch and kind of tying it to like lava and volcano. And so we ended up doing this really interesting gloss black finish, but had these sort of details that felt like lava in terms of the color and the way it like changes from red to yellow. But I believe that is all. Yeah, that is sort of my journey. And now, I mean, I am still working for Nike right now, but part-time. So I'm doing like contract work for them and now working on like women's training shoes and actually some soccer cleats too. So it's been kind of fun to like get back into that space again.
So I have a question real quick.
Yeah.
So you said that your first internship was at Paxson, correct?
No, my first internship, I've had a lot of weird internships, but I'd say my first major internship was at this fashion company called Theory.
Okay.
If you know that.
What like sets you apart from like other people applying to the same position?
To the internship or
Yeah.
to
The internship.
Honestly, I think a part of it was the network that I like. That particular internship was through a friend that I had known who was already working in the industry and knew different friends who were in there. So they like forwarded my work over. So it was a little bit of networking and then also just having strong work, you know?
Yeah.
I think usually by recommendations is always like a really good surefire shot because it's like, you know, if you know someone who then knows someone else and they have a good rapport and they trust them, they trust like, you know, the recommendation. Like that's where like networking is really important in those kinds of things.
Yeah, right. Because I know like, so I'm a freshman, so basically I'm trying to get an internship right now. So I'm just kind of like comparing how people like designers right now, how they got their first internship, what route they took, so that I can, you know, follow in that kind of path. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like networking is huge. Like, I don't know how much they emphasize that now in schools, but like, you know, even just like cold emailing, like I did that a lot when I was in undergrad. I would just cold email a bunch of different companies and just see who would like respond back. You know, it's like if you know someone who knows someone who works there, it usually is the best way to like maneuver into that space and don't be shy, you know, like I think if you set out, I'm always a true believer, if you set out with good intentions, like usually good things happen. Anyone else? I'm gonna stop sharing. Is that cool?
I actually had a question. It's kind of more generic, but if you could give yourself, your like younger self, good advice that you know now, something you wish you knew a while ago, what would that be?
I would say if I could give my younger self advice is that when you're right out of undergrad, like even when you land your first job, like don't stay at it for too long. Like honestly, like just go and explore and try. And internships are a great way into that. Just like try so many different things. Cause like you might think you're on one path and you stick on it for like a few years and then you're like, wait a minute, now I'm really bored or I'm really like wanting something different. You just like have no idea. And I think the more you get used to the idea of trying different things and getting comfortable with that shift, I think it helps. At least this is coming from my own perspective, but like that's what I would tell my younger self is like maybe not sticking like as long as I did at Nike. 5 years, I would say, is a long time, especially like right for my first job. Like not many of my peers who are in design have stuck with the company for that long, especially with their first job. But you know, I wouldn't change it. I'm really glad I did because I learned the breadth of product and understanding of Nike as a brand. I like feel like that has made me so much just stronger in terms of how I think about design and branding and how that affects my own personal practice. It's definitely had a strong influence. And so I don't regret it at all, but I would say like if I would tell my younger self, like, yeah, just try it, just like, I don't know, every year go try to apply for a different job and just see where you end up.
Yeah.
So I had a question. So when you were in college, did you have any ideas of how your future would look like? Did you want to do anything certain? No, just wanted to do whatever came at you.
Well, I was like, I think what I said like before, I like was so, I thought I was gonna go into fashion. I was like, the fashion world is for me. Like I just like loved, I was such a huge like, I am such a huge like fan of fashion and what stuff comes out of there. But it's funny because now that I'm a lot older and have experienced like the industry and just I'm glad I didn't go into fashion because I think I would have had a lot more of like an identity crisis in terms of the way it's that kind of structure is now and how it's undergoing a lot of change. But um, wait, sorry, what was your original question again?
So basically, did you always want to design shoes, or did you just end
Oh,
up?
no, I had no idea at all I was ever going to work at Nike. Like I never owned a pair of Nikes in my life until I started working at Nike. So I think it is less about thinking about designing shoes per se, but it's more about the like design process and design thinking that I really respected about Nike as a company. Like they are very design driven, and I think it's cool when you have a big global company like that because the way they think about products and how that comes to life in the market and how they're considering all these variables. It's just like it's just interesting, you know. It's like it's conceptual in its own way. Like I like to think about it like that versus like, oh, I'm just, you know, designing materials for a shoe. It's like, well, you are, but the way that you think about how these things are coming together and how you work collaboratively with your teammates and all of these things that have to happen, like it sometimes I think of it more than just a shoe.
Thank you. I was just wondering because I have there's so many things I want to do. I don't know if I should focus on a certain area or just learn how to do everything. Well, I know like designing anything, there's a certain process, but
Mhm.
like designing something that I like.
Yeah, I think one thing to keep in mind is like as a designer, like designing is like a kind of way of working or a way of thinking or a process, and it's not necessarily about the thing you design. I mean, of course, you know, some people do go into specifically furniture design or automotive or sneakers or whatever, but I think like if you're able to like work more nimbly, I don't know, like I think it's a good thing to like just consider how what your relationship to that process looks like, and then how that actually manifests into the products will just like work out, you know. Like I think a successful designer in my personal opinion is able to navigate different kinds of objects and products. It's just about that kind of problem solving ultimately.
Thank you.
I have another question. Going back to identity and things like that, what's next in your life, and what is design? Yeah, what are your next projects, and how do you envision it?
Hmm. Well, in the studio right now, I've been kind of trying to push some new vessel forms, and I've been turning a lot of. I have a lathe now in my studio, so I've been turning these small objects that I call butt plugs because they do look like butt plugs. But anyways, I'm just like pressing them into these glass forms and like looking at the ways that those forms are interacting with these weird butt plugs. So I've been thinking about that as my own personal practice and just experimenting with materials and form. And then in terms of like, you know, my bigger kind of thinking about like what's next as like just like other design work, like I have been considering, you know, I have like a contract with Nike right now, but considering like, oh, would I want to work for a different company? Like, would I want to like stretch my kind of experience into other like sectors? So that's something I've been thinking about in sort of tandem with my own practice. I think, you know, there's a lot of people out there who just have who really work on their practice as a way to make money. But right now I'm kind of like trying to do both, where it's like I have a stable form of income and a good job that allows me and still gives me time to think about my own design projects. So that's sort of where I'm at right now.
Thank you. Have you ever considered going into another country and working there, getting new forms and ideas from other people from other countries?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've considered working, like it'd be cool to work in Taiwan. Like that's my background is my parents are from Taiwan and I visited a bunch when I was working with Nike. So I thought that would be really cool to go back there and get more in touch with my roots. But I think for the foreseeable future, maybe not, just because, the state of the world. But yeah, but I've thought about it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So I'm very interesting work. Thank you so much for sharing your portfolio. So I'm like very intrigued by like what inspires people. So I was just wondering like what inspires you? Is there like, do you have a favorite designer or a couple favorite designers or like any favorite maybe podcasts or like YouTubers that you would recommend for inspiration sources?
Oh yeah, I'm always so bad at that kind of question. Though I would say for podcasts, I just like thinking about what I just recently listened to, but I've been listening to like the Ezra Klein show, which I don't know if you guys follow him. He's like the co-founder of Vox. So he's a really great podcast out there. And then I also listen to Reply All, which is another really great podcast. It's kind of like pseudo technology, kind of and then designers, I always, that question's always so hard because I feel like I look at so many designers. Let's see. Yeah, that's a hard one. I do like some of the work out right now by some of these like fine designers. Like, do you guys know the work of like Misha Khan or Katie Stout? They're kind of at that intersection of design and craft because they a lot of their work is very heavily like they have a team of people working on them, but like there's this kind of commentary on like ambiguity and kind of questioning like gender roles, but it's like through the lens of design and craft, which is really interesting. So they have some great work out. Jesse Reeves is another one who's kind of part of that camp. But yeah, there's a lot of good stuff happening in the world right now. It's really interesting.
Awesome. Thank you. You said you're not good at the answering it, but you're great. I mean, you mentioned people and podcasts I haven't heard of. So thank you.
Oh yeah, no problem.
This is not really a question per se. I guess it is. What do you think about the new Nike shoes that are meant for the older generation that you just like put your foot on and it kind of like goes like that? And then, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's the one that like slips on and off and you
Yeah.
can I forget what they're called, but I know it's like for that whole initiative for that kind of ease of entry is actually for people like with disabilities who have a harder people with disabilities who have a harder time putting shoes on. And so I think that they've had that initiative for a couple of years now with different kinds of shoes. It's just that one I think had so much like design visibility. It might have been like covered on Dizine or something, but I think they're cool. I think the direction is really interesting in that really starting to design or putting at the forefront that kind of design that's speaking to people with disabilities, and that's something that is becoming more and more of an important conversation that companies are having. So I think they're cool.
Yeah, no, I really like them. I ordered a pair and I'm excited.
Oh, nice. Yeah, you'll have to tell me how they feel. Like, is it that easy to like, they'd like have the little video that shows you how you put it on. You're like, is it really that easy?
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah.
So does anyone have any more questions before we yeah, go ahead.
I have so many questions just because I'm really interested in like sneakers and just actually design in general. How involved are you or were you when you were working at Nike of sneakers.com, StockX, and that whole revolution and unlimited sneakers?
Not that involved with those kinds of like, I don't know if you'd call them like third-party retailers, but yeah, no, not that involved, honestly. I think like, yeah, and I don't think Nike like has like close contact. I mean, I could be wrong. I'm like coming at it from a designer and like not like marketing or branding or whatever, but I don't know how much connectivity or conversations they have um with each other. Yeah.
Okay, I just pointed that out just because we live all in Detroit, and that's a big aspect of that sneaker culture and Kobe's and LeBron, and all that sector. So I was just wondering how that it goes from the designer to like the actual customer that really cares about the shoes.
Well, I know we as designers that are part of Nike, we do a lot of like market travel and market research with marketing partners. And so not to say we'll go and interview a StockX person, but maybe we'll go interview someone who is a retailer that carries Nike shoes like in Miami, like at a strip mall, like there is a lot of dialogue between designers and those sorts of retailers in terms of getting consumer feedback, market feedback, or athlete insights. Like oftentimes when I was working for like basketball, we'd go and meet with like high school basketball players and get their sort of like insights as to like what shoes they played in, which shoes was like the most comfortable or not comfortable, like why, like who their favorite players are, what their style of play. So there's still like a lot of research that goes into getting a better understanding of who we're designing for. But I think it's different than like meeting with like a StockX person or with other retailers.
That was actually, can you, that was actually kind of the question I was going to try to ask, similar, I guess, about how involved you are with like the customer research side of things. I know that's something we focus on a lot as undergrads, but like I think a lot of the work that I see a lot of times from professional designers in industry is highly focused on like the end result, as opposed to more of the like consumer research. So I was wondering if you think there's a lot of like opportunities for that. I think I just don't see a lot of that necessarily when I'm like looking for internships as well, like things focus more on the research side.
Mm-hmm. The research side is a huge component, especially for corporate design or any of those like bigger bigger scale type companies that are making a lot of product. Like that market research is a huge component to like what designers have to sort of understand. And I think on the flip side, like earlier in my presentation or my slides, I showed like my own personal work, which not really talking too much about the specific like target consumer audience, because I think that kind of work is more speaking to like an art form or more so in that kind of context. So it's very different. But yeah, we did so much as designers. We partner very closely with the marketing team to better understand like what the needs of the market are. And like they always say, like the consumer is first, like the athlete is first, like like what they want is ultimately like how you should think about how to best frame your design work, your design thinking. And so I would say it is really important if you're thinking about those kinds of companies or industries.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I know you've touched on this idea kind of throughout of like the difference between like corporate and more like personal individual design. For you, or maybe just in general, do you see like a space where those kind of can combine a little more?
I'm still trying to figure that out. I mean, I do have some friends. I do know people who are at a point where they're sort of scaling their design work. They're maybe doing small batch production work, and it's like their own personal brand. I think that's the thing that I've been trying to figure out is like, how much of that do I want to take on in terms of like my own small business? And so, you know, for me, like, what does it mean to have this kind of creative practice? Like, what does it mean to me? And like, I don't know if like capitalizing it or commodifying it gets into the space where I have a different relationship to that kind of expression as a designer. So that's why I was saying earlier, like, oh, I might even consider like looking to other companies and still getting a full-time job again, but then having something on the side or doing some like similar to Noor design collective work as a way to keep my own creative personal growth going, you know, because it's really easy to lose sight of that once you start to work full-time for a different company. It's important to still, like, if you want to stay creative and sharp, like still feed that curiosity and creativity in your own way, because, you know, Nike with all its meetings and all of the things I gotta do, it just sometimes can drain a little bit in its own way. So it's important to keep that balance.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have one last question. It's a silly one. Do you guys ever get to keep the products you design?
Sometimes, yeah.
Oh, cool.
I mean, I worked on men's shoes, so I can't wear any of them. But yeah,
That's your boyfriend, huh? He has a lot of Nikes now.
yeah, but there's sample sizes, so it's not the right size either. So yeah, it depends. I just got actually a pair of sneakers through the mail from a design director, because he just learned that I do CrossFit. He's like, I'm sending you some shoes, and I happen to be the right size. So it just depends. There are a lot of shoes around at Nike.
I have a question. Like, it's nice to see your Nike work. I am more familiar with your own studio work. You were talking about all these different iterations, and I think it will be nice to understand like how many iterations you normally go through in a one shoe project, I guess.
Oh my gosh, so many. So many. Depending on the complexity of the shoe, like, you know, I've done the shoe project that's just swap out this material that's an existing pattern, you know, so I just swap out materials. But then you get from that kind of project to one where it's completely new upper, it's completely new design and completely new bottom unit. And so that is usually the hardest one, because that goes through so many iterations and there's so much testing involved. And depending on what, you know, what category of sport you're in, like it'll go through different kinds of testing. So like, you know, on one basketball shoe, I probably have gone through like 6 different new material ideas. There's so much iteration that happens in this sort of like back and forth between the design side and then the like execution. They'll send, you know, we'll design something, send it out, they'll send us back a sample, it'll like not look right, and then we send out some, you know, it happens like so many times. So that's just a part of the design world. And now that I'm saying this, I'm like, maybe this is why I don't like prototyping in my own practice. I'm like, I just want to like get an idea, do it, execute it, it's done. Maybe that's just my own like rejection of the way that I've worked in the industry.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I have one more question.
Mm-hmm.
So if you wanted to, or whose call would it be to work with like a recyclable material? Let's just say somebody wanted to work with like recycled plastics, for example. Like, what would that look like?
In a company like Nike?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, usually those kinds of big sustainability initiatives, like when I was working there, like wasn't like just starting to gain traction. Like, I mean, now it's like it's like so ubiquitous in every company's like mission statement that sustainability is part of the like equation now. But back in the day, it would be like, you know, we like a select group that's like part of it, the innovation team would come up with this platform of sustainability that involves maybe using recycled plastics. And then how do you get that into like a scalability how do you scale that for production? And so is it like a small batch production of shoes versus like, how, I guess they're starting to get to a point where it's like, how do you make that more like scalable so it's mass production? So it usually comes from like a small group of people leading an initiative, and then it eventually like gets adopted by the wider company and gets blown out in different ways. But usually at like from the early days of those conversations, like it really came from a different group versus like me as someone who was like in the category doing the product creation work. Like I didn't have time to focus on that each season because it's a different timeline. But then there's other groups that focus on more of that broader timeline or scope of, that sort of sustainability initiative. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, that was all I wanted to ask. Thank you.
Any more questions or we're good? Okay. Thank you so much, Karen. Nur, do you have anything to say? You're good?
No, I'm good. Thank you very much for coming, Karen. This was our first event. I think it was very successful. Thank you being part of it.
Yeah.
We'll keep you posted with our future events.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And if you have any questions about anything, you can always shoot me a DM. I think it's on your guys' Instagram, my username. But yeah, feel free to just send a message or anything. More than happy to answer questions.
Thank you again
you.
so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you so very much.
Good luck with the rest of your semester.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.